This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra. Thank you for listening to Beyond the Big Screen podcast, where we talk about great movies and stories so great they should be movies. Find show notes, links to subscribe, and leave Apple Podcast reviews by going to our website, beyondthebigscreen.com. And now, let's go beyond the big screen.
Hey, welcome back to Beyond the Big Screen. I'm Mustache Chris with my friend Frank, and we're going to discuss the 1986 movie Manhunter. I'm not quite sure if the audience is... There's probably a lot of people that don't even know this movie exists. I don't know. What do you think, Frank?
Well, much to their loss if they don't. This is quite literally in my top 10 all time, easily.
Yeah, because I mentioned it to a couple people at work that I was going to be recording a podcast called Manhunter, and they're like, I've never heard of it. And I'm like, well, it's the first movie with Hannibal Lecter, and I just don't think it's a well-known movie. It's more of a cult classic type thing, but...
well, yeah, and it's also the name, the title is also, it's been used in a couple other projects too, so there's room for confusion there. But yeah, I would say you could definitely call this an underappreciated film by the public at large, and hopefully we're going to explain to you why it should be appreciated.
Yeah. So I guess we get into some of the technical details. Manhunter was directed by Michael Mann, was produced by Richard A. Roth. Cinematography, which we're going to get into a lot, actually, because it's one of my favorite parts of the film, is Dante Spinotti. And the production company was De Laurentiis Entertainment Group, who produced many great films. I don't think they're around anymore. The cast is William Peterson as Will Graham, Tom Noonan as Francis Dollarhide, Dennis Farina as Jack Crawford. I'm sure you guys probably know him from Law and Order. Brian Cox as Hannibal Lecter, and I think
probably know him from Succession.
Yeah, and Brian Cox is, I guess most people, at least younger people, probably know him from, he's in the X-Men, right?
Also, a couple of actors who had small roles here that became bigger actors later on. I mean, Joan Allen as Reba, she became a pretty well-known leading lady later on. And then Stephen Lang, he's still around making movies and as a lead or as a main character in a lot of TV and movies. And he had a small role in this movie as well.
Yeah, so this movie is based on the book Red Dragon by Thomas Harris, too, who's famous for the Silence of the Lambs franchise, I guess, with starring Anthony Hopkins and
Jodie Foster,
and there was the movie Hannibal. Maybe one day we can get into that, because I have mixed opinions on that movie. And in some ways it's a lot of fun, but in other ways I think it kind of ruined the franchise. But regardless, this was actually the first film to have Hannibal Lecter in it.
Now, you haven't read the book, have you?
No, I haven't read any of the books, to be honest with you.
Oh, really? Oh, okay.
So
it's a good book. It's an excellent book, and we'll talk about it later on, I think. But there are a few key differences. I mean, there's always differences. I mean, we talked about The Godfather on Organized Crime and Punishment recently, and there are major differences in between the book and the movie there. But a lot of times, when they make a film from a book, it's about what you have to cut out in order to get this, what's the core of the story, because that's all you have time for in a movie. If you're making like a Netflix show, you could dive a little deeper into all the subplots and that kind of stuff. So that always happens, but there's a different ending in the book, and we'll talk about that later on. And there's a much larger chunk of time spent on Dollarhide at about the same place in the story, but it like goes back to his childhood and everything. And so it mirrors the film in that way. Michael Mann did a good job of mirroring the book in that way, and something that we'll talk about in a bit, I think, is what the impact of that is on the reader or the viewer when it comes to how they look at Dollarhide.
Oh, that's interesting because, yeah, I think I've mentioned this before on the podcast. I'm not a huge novel reader. Like I've read a lot of classics. I probably read more novels than most people. I've read all the classics for the most part, I think, depending on what is considered the classics. For the most part, in terms of storytelling, I prefer film as my medium to consume. But I don't know. Maybe I'll get into them and read those novels.
It's a well-crafted book. Yeah, it's a well-crafted book. If you enjoyed the film, I think you'd enjoy the book. Thomas Harris is a good writer, and it's a good adaptation. But with any adaptation, as I said, you're going to get differences. And the smart filmmaker, learns what can be left by the side of the road and not destroy the story in doing so. And definitely Michael Mann. And I don't have the note here who wrote the screenplay, because that's an art unto itself too, right? The adaptation.
It's actually Michael Mann who wrote the screenplay.
That doesn't surprise me at all. He's a good writer, and when you have the director and the writer be the same person, I think you get a real strong, cohesive vision for the film. Whether it's good or not, that's another issue entirely. But at least it's going to be consistent, and it's going to be made in a way that makes sense. Whereas sometimes when you have two different people doing that job, there can be conflict between the vision the writer had and then the way that, it's being interpreted again, once more by the director. I mean, it went from the book to the screenplay to the direction, not to mention, of course, how the actors interpret it. At least when you merge that screenplay directing mode, there's just more cohesion there.
Yeah, I'd have to look up Michael Mann's filmography and how many, he strikes me as the type of guy that would probably write all his screenplays, just because everything that I've read about him and just seeing how his films are filmed, they're very precise. There's almost kind of like a psychotic nature that comes across in his films, because you could tell that he's sat and thought about this shot for years, and everything has to be perfect. They're very, I don't want to use the word mechanical, because that means it comes across they don't convey a lot of emotion. That just, you could tell that there's a lot of precision in his films. And it seems like a guy that's has to be in control of everything. Now, Miami Vice is kind of thought of as kind of a joke now, the TV show, but those first 2 seasons were groundbreaking in terms of television.
I don't know why it would be considered a joke. I mean, it was definitely a product of its times, but it was saying that it was ahead of its time. I mean, I was a teenager when it was on live, and my dad watched it too. And he commented one time that it was made so much better than your average TV show, and it was like watching a 1-hour movie every week, as opposed to the way a lot of network TV is shot. And I thought that was a real apt way to put it. That it was a show that was shot like a film every week, and a lot of the style and technique that you first saw there definitely made its way into the film we're talking about now.
Yeah, man. Oh, yeah, for sure. That's the first thing I'll jump off the screen to is the hyper stylized nature of this film. But I guess we can get into a little bit of the background of this film. Probably the first thing people ask is, it's a weird title for a movie, right, Frank? Manhunter.
Mm-hmm.
And
it's not the title of the book, which, they don't always do it that way. But a lot of times the Silence of the Lambs was based on a book called The Silence of the Lambs.
Yeah. So I did a little bit of research into how did it get this weird title? Apparently Dino Laurentiis was worried that because there was a bunch of kung fu movies and stuff like that were coming out at the time, and that used the word dragon or red dragon, things of that nature. So he was concerned that people would think it was a kung fu movie. And he also had a film that came out, I believe it was earlier that year, or it could have been maybe a year ago, The Year of the Dragon, that starred Mickey Rourke, which I suggest to everybody go watch, because I actually quite like that movie. But it bombed at the box office. So he just didn't want the title Dragon in the film, for those 2 reasons. So that's how we kind of came up with got to the title Manhunter. I don't know. What do you think of that? That's kind of like Hollywood, superstition, or involved. I just think that's so funny. I mean, it probably would have sold better if they just kept the original title with it, wouldn't it?
I don't know. I do know that. I mean, I didn't have a problem with the title, but it is interesting how they came to it. The Year of the Dragon came out in '85, the year before, and that Mickey Rourke movie, and I agree with you. It was actually a pretty good movie, and just for whatever reason didn't do well. Titles are important. Often it's the first thing people see, about a book or a movie, even before they see a cover or a poster or a clip or whatever. And so, the title's got to work. And I think Manhunter works. It's just a little different, Yeah,
I said the title to a couple other people and they're like, oh, that's a weird title for a movie. And I was like, yeah, I personally, I don't mind. Like, I've grown to like the title, but I can kind of see at the time, the movie came out and the title was Manhunter, I can kind of be like, oh, that's an interesting title for a movie. But I guess moving along, apparently David Lynch was actually considered to direct this movie for a little bit.
What a different movie that would be.
Yeah, Dino Laurentiis had previously worked with him on Dune, wanted to work with him again, and David just wasn't. Apparently there's interviews where David's talking about his next film, Red Dragon, and I haven't watched them, but apparently he just doesn't seem like he's all that into it. And David Lynch apparently said like it's just the source material is just sick and depraved and wanted nothing to do with it, which is kind of ironic coming from David Lynch. Like I'm not going to sit here and say like David Lynch's work is sick and depraved. Like I'm probably
I will.
But it's not like sick and depraved for just the sake of it.
But it's kind of, the pot calling the kettle black a little bit though.
I don't want to get into Twin Peaks just because Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me, the themes that are in that film are just, honestly, it's probably the most extreme form of depravity, I guess, that's ever been put on film, at least for Hollywood, right? But saying what it is, I end up ruining the TV show and the movie, so I don't want to get into it. But like David's known for pretty extreme stuff in his films. I just think it's funny that he would think that about this film. I mean, I don't know. It's kind of bizarre.
Especially when the subject matter is pretty gruesome. I mean, it's a serial killer movie, but if you watch it with an eye toward how graphic is this movie, there's really not that much graphic detail in the movie. There's some photographs and there's one scene where he goes to the crime scene, which is just amazingly shot from a filmmaking standpoint. And, so you see a lot of blood, but the bodies aren't there, I think people think that have seen it and think back to it, probably think this is a more gruesome film than it actually objectively is on this, on the screen, which is a testament, I think, to great filmmaking by Michael Mann, making us feel and see with our mind's eye in addition to just what he's showing on the screen.
Well, yeah, that's exactly it. And, in terms, like I've seen this film a gazillion times, but it's the one thing that really does stand out to you for like a serial killer movie. There's nothing there really. All the violence that happens is kind of off screen. There's a gunfight at the end, but there's not like huge, like bloody gunshot wounds.
No, that gunfight could have taken place on Miami Vice or The Shield or, Blue Bloods. I mean, it wasn't that graphic.
And so I guess kind of getting to a little bit of the acting was apparently like William Peterson to kind of get in the mind frame of the role, worked with the Chicago Violence Crime Unit and the FBI Violent Crimes Unit. And he actually went so far as to speak with people that were working on the Night Stalker case, which I guess was going on at the time. Basically kind of dove into their minds like, well, how do you separate the two things? Like, how do you keep the stuff that you're learning at work separate from your private life? And the conclusion that he reached was, you can do it to a degree, but eventually if you do it long enough, it's going to seep into your private life. Like, how could it not? You're investigating literally about as evil as it can possibly get in terms of how human beings can be to one another. And that's not really what human beings are supposed to be doing to one another, obviously. And as a human being yourself, you your natural inclination is to try to stay as far away from it as possible. But, some people have to make that sacrifice so we can try to get some of these guys off the streets. This as a cop, Frank, or a former cop, I should say.
Yeah. I mean, I never worked a serial killer case. I was not a homicide detective, so I didn't have those experiences, but I can tell you that I think any job has the potential to seep into your personal life. And I think the more intense that job is, higher the likelihood, and working in law enforcement in any capacity, I think there's a high danger of that seepage happening. And then as you drill down into the more specialized parts of that profession, into something like what Will Graham was doing in this film, there's no way that doesn't seep into your personal life. And Graham, as we're going to get into, he goes a step deeper. Like, he's not just investigating the homicides. I mean, there are a number of people doing that, and they're trying to do so clinically, right? He is doing what, we would now call profiling. And people should remember, this was 1986. This is before the behavioral science unit at the FBI was a household name, before the concept of profiling a serial killer was on Dateline every week or whatever. This was well ahead of that time period, or certainly at the front end of it. And so what Graham is depicted as doing on screen, trying to get into the mind of the killer, was a little more novel. It was a little newer. It was a little bit more off the beaten path. And even though we've seen a lot of that since then, we haven't seen, I don't think, any depictions of the consequences of that, of the impact of that on the individual who's doing it. And that's one of the things that I think at the core is so masterful about the storytelling in this. Like, you're going to talk a lot about the cinematography, and I'm 100% on board with what I'm pretty sure you're going to say about that, because it's stunning. But the core of the story is about Graham's sacrifice and what it costs him. And that's not something that gets explored as much, I don't think. So I'm pretty excited to dive some more into that. Whatever Peterson did to prepare for this, the stuff you described and any other activities he did, it sure paid off, because he inhabits this role.
Yeah, see, that's how you bring that up in terms of the consequences for the characters getting involved in this type of activity. That's always been my biggest problem with, I would say, a lot of copycat shows, right? Stuff like CSI and a bunch of other like kind of police procedural shows, is they present a case and it's like, okay, the case is interesting, but it's done in such a way that it's cheesy and it's light. And I know that sounds crazy talking about a show like CSI, but you don't actually see the consequences, say, for the family or the people involved in investigating these cases. And that's what I've always found interesting. That's why I enjoyed the show Twin Peaks, where like you have one murder and it's just the one murder, and it's about how does this murder affect the entire town and each individual, and obviously the police that are involved in investigating this murder. There's another show too that both me and you have talked about, The Killing, where it was one murder in the first season, which I think is probably one of the best television series of like seasons of television ever. And it's about the effect that it has on the police in terms of the people investigating the case, and then family, which is really, at the end of the day, if you're going to tackle a subject matter such as this, say a serial killer or a murderer, that really should be the focus. It shouldn't be just this cat and mouse, like, oh, it's like a game of chess where it's like they move there and we move there, and it's, oh, I got the guy, and it's like, let's go have a donut after and laugh about it, which is the impression I always got off those CSI shows and the endless ripoffs of them.
Yeah, in real life, at least and again, I was not a homicide detective, but I certainly was around the job long enough to see these things, and I've consulted for my own work, my own novels, with friends of mine who did that work to try to ensure authenticity. And one of the things that always comes up in even in non-homicide cases, just in any serious case, is how much the investigator identifies with and feels like he or she is serving the family as much as the victim. the deceased. And that sometimes I think that's not exciting. That's not sexy. It doesn't make good television. It's not as good as a car chase or a fist fight. And I get that, it's a different kind of drama, but it's also more true to life. And if you think about it from a human perspective, if you're an investigator, yeah, the motivation to catch the guy is certainly there. And that's definitely driving you. But after a while, that can't be the only thing. Like the idea that I always get my man or woman, if they did something wrong, I'm going to catch them. That becomes stilted and not as motivating after a period of time. But when you realize that your efforts it's not just internal motivation that you're dealing with, but there's some external motivation too, in that you're giving the family closure, or you're getting, or even a burglary case or something, you're giving a family their stuff back, or making them feel safe because the person who broke into their house is going to jail now, or if you're thinking about it in terms of service as a term, as opposed to terms of accomplishment or a task or a challenge, and the two aren't mutually exclusive, but the service part really fuels that. And real life, homicide detectives, while they do many of the things that you see on TV in terms of investigation, the one thing that they don't show as much is those interactions with the family.
Steve here. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring great shows like Richard Lim's This American President and other great shows. Go to parthenonpodcast.com to learn more, and here is a quick word from our sponsors.
So I guess move on to Tom Noonan. Like, apparently initially when Tom Noonan, who plays the Tooth Fairy, the Red Dragon, Frank, whatever you want to call him. I've always kind of just referred to him as the Tooth Fairy whenever I talk about this film. Apparently, he initially researched serial killers for the role, which makes sense, but he didn't like the research. It made him depressed, and it made him sick, and which makes sense. You would think, of course, that's the reaction you should have when researching these guys. Especially if you're trying to get as deep as, say, Tom Noonan was. You're trying to inhabit the mind of these serial killers for your role. So he came to the conclusion that he would play the role in such a way that he felt that the character was helping these people, that they were being part of something larger than themselves, even though they didn't really understand it. And apparently on set, so if he had to have an interaction with somebody for a scene, they were not allowed to see Tom not as the Tooth Fairy. So a lot of the times when they first see him, he's 100% in character. And apparently on set, he was just absolutely terrifying. Like, you just did not want to be around this guy because he felt like he looked and came across like a serial killer. And I could 100% see it. Like, Tom's not like a big guy in the sense of like, oh, he's thick, but he's very tall. He's got to be at least 6'5", 6'6", right?
Yeah, I think he's 6'5". And in the movie, they show his driver's license and dollar height is 6'7". But a little piece of trivia, I think that was like 2 inches higher than what the actor actually is. And I also think you talked about him kind of keeping his distance and always being in character, where Graham's character is concerned. Like, he wanted to never meet Peterson on set or have anything to do with him until they shot their climactic scene there at the end. And Michael Mann agreed that was a good idea, and they had to do some juggling, and I guess there was some logistics involved, but they managed to carry that off. So that adds a wrinkle to it when you get to that final scene. And, the two actors, really, it's not like they've been buddying around for, 2 months while they're making their separate scenes in this film. They only know each other through how their characters have reacted to the other character. So I think it definitely adds some authenticity there.
I think I read somewhere, you mentioned you read the book, that the character he was much thicker, right? He was also tall, but he was kind of more built like a bodybuilder type. And this Tom he's a big guy. He's intimidating, like just because of his height. And you could tell that, he's thin and he's got a kind of more kind of like an athletic physique. Where in the book, apparently the killer was like, he was more powerful looking. Is that true?
I don't remember, to be honest with you. I remember scenes where he was lifting weights. So I do think he was a little bit more ripped, and thicker than, like Tom Noonan, he's built more like a hockey player,
Yeah.
He in terms of like, kind of ripcord strength as opposed to bulk. I don't think that Francis Dolarhyde in the book was a football player. I think he was probably more like a baseball player, that they tend to be a little thicker maybe than the hockey players. But he was definitely, one of the things Michael Mann did, it's interesting in the book, about 2/3 of the way through, Thomas Harris throws the brakes on. So here we've been chasing with Will Graham, this serial killer, for 2/3 of the book. Now all of a sudden we're reading about little 6-year-old Francis Dolarhyde with his cleft palate being maltreated by a grandmother, I think it was. And you spend about, of the last third of the book, you spend about a third of that getting this backstory of Francis Dolarhyde, which really has to make people reassess how they feel about this serial killer. And Michael Mann didn't do that in the film, as we both know. He did do a little bit of the whole relationship with Reba section to kind of try to accomplish that a little bit. But he I think he did a good job of making us not hate Dolarhyde quite as much as we might otherwise have, because he toned down some of the stuff that Dolarhyde was doing. I mean, Dolarhyde was raping the women when he killed them. Not to be disgusting, but he wasn't just killing them. He was sexually assaulting them as they were dying and filming it. And that's pretty gross. And that's, would have bumped this R rating up to tickling NC-17 had it existed at the time. And so by not, they don't say he didn't rape them, because they talk about semen left at the scene in a very, antiseptic way as they're talking about evidence and so forth. But by not showing that and not focusing on that, I think, that's one way that Michael Mann helps put us in a position where when we see Dolarhyde later on with Reba, we can feel a twinge of sympathy for him briefly. And I think that's important, because he's the flip side of Will Graham, right? I mean, Will Graham's trying to be bad in order to catch the Tooth Fairy, and the Tooth Fairy for a few moments is trying to see what it might be like to be good. I mean, that's a gross oversimplification, but you kind of see my point.
Yeah. So that's wild that's in the book. There's no way that could have got filmed. Like, I wouldn't even have wanted to watch that film, to be honest with you.
But they don't even mention it, right? They don't even mention it. And
I was going to say, maybe they could have mentioned it, but
I think it's good that they didn't. I think that was a right call by Michael Mann. It occurs to me that for those folks who have never seen the movie, that maybe we could give a a thumbnail sketch of the setup of what the film is about. I mean, you probably could have guessed by listening to us, but nothing's less fun than watching two people talk about a movie you've never seen and you don't know what it's about to boot. So the setup is there's a serial killer at work. He's on a lunar cycle. So once a month, the full moon, he's killed 2 complete families, one in Birmingham and one in Atlanta. And the film opens with FBI, special agent in charge, I guess would be his rank probably, Jack Crawford, played by Dennis Farina, trying to recruit Will Graham, a former agent, back into the fold because of how he has a special knack for catching these guys. He's caught 2 of them in the past, one of them being Hannibal Lecter. And he employs methods that people at the time weren't too aware of. And it's that profiling that we talked about earlier on. So Graham comes back into the fold against his better judgment. He's got a wife and son, and he's got a happy life. And yet he knows good and well that if he doesn't get involved, this guy could keep going for a long time. And so he's driven by that duty. And so he gets back into it, and he's investigating the crime scenes, and he's talking to people, and they're trying to catch the Tooth Fairy. And I think that's really all you need to know to follow the rest of the story.
The next actor to kind of get into a little bit would be Brian Cox, right? He plays Hannibal Lecter, which I assume if you asked most people, they probably have no idea that Brian Cox was the first guy to play Hannibal Lecter. Everyone, just because Anthony Hopkins is just so iconic in the role. But he apparently he used a serial killer named Peter Manuel as a kind of a template for his character. But there were other people apparently that they were interested in playing the role of Hannibal Lecter. Michael Mann was Brian Dennehy was one. Believe it or not, William Friedkin. He thought using William Friedkin as Hannibal Lecter would have been. I don't recall William Friedkin doing any acting, but I could be wrong about that. I don't know. What do you think? They ended up picking Brian Cox based on Brian Dennehy's suggestion, because apparently he saw Brian Cox and it was some theater play or something like that. I can't recall which play it was, and he's, you got to use this guy. But
yeah, he had worked with Brian Cox. And he told Michael Mann, as much as I would love this role, the guy that you need is Brian Cox. So on Dennehy's recommendation, Mann, or the casting person, went to that play that you're talking about and saw Brian Cox and thought, yeah, this guy might be the one. Let's screen test him. And so, in addition to studying the serial killer to prepare for the role, he based his performance, like his mannerisms, on being like just a British, prep school boy. And he had like a 15-year-old son at the time. So he basically channeled his 15-year-old son in terms of like presentation, how he presented. But I'm going to go a little hot take here, and people are probably going to think I'm being snooty to say it, but I think Brian Cox's Hannibal Lecter is a better Hannibal Lecter than even Anthony Hopkins. And I love Anthony Hopkins. Legends of the Fall, I mean, he's fantastic in that, and he's just been great in so many shows. But Anthony Hopkins' version of Lecter is a horror version of the character, I think. It's a horror character in a suspenseful crime film, whereas this is a procedural film. It's about the process of catching the bad guy, and Lecter is chilling and frightening, and monstrous, but he's not a horror character in here. He's a criminal. And for that reason, I think he's a much more grounded character and much more real, and therefore more terrifying. You believe Hannibal Lecter when Anthony Hopkins plays him, but you believe him as a horror character on the screen. I think when you watch Brian Cox's depiction, he seems like a real guy that that could exist in real life. And I find that more terrifying. Now, rules of primacy may be in place here. I mean, obviously I saw Manhunter before I saw Silence of the Lambs. So, maybe I'm just going with, I liked him first because I saw him first or something like that. But, I think he's only on the screen for like 14 minutes or something like that. It's a very small runtime, very small period, amount of screen time when pitted against the whole runtime of the film. But he has an outsized impact, I think. You feel like he spent twice as much time on the screen.
It's exactly how I feel too. And you pointed out his performance is much more realistic. I've actually done a fair amount of research on like serial killers and watching interviews and stuff like that, just because I find it a bit fascinating. And just the way he talks, he talks like a real person, where, like, as you pointed out, like Anthony Hopkins, it's more kind of like a horror film character. Like I think this is less so his performance in Silence of the Lambs and more so his performance in Hannibal and, all the sequels that happened afterwards. He, to me, is, I don't know, his performance is up there with he's like kind of like Freddy Krueger or Leatherface, where he's become, which is not a bad thing. He's become like a horror character that's, you could clearly tell is playing a role, where Brian Cox, you can it doesn't feel like that at all. It feels like you're watching guy Hannibal Lecter who almost killed Will Graham and eats people. You know, he's just insane.
Yeah, his portrayal was just outstanding. And you know, if people like Anthony Hopkins' version better, they're not wrong by any means. I mean, the guy won an Oscar for that, and he is, like I said, a tremendous actor, and I've liked him in many different movies. But there's just something chilling about the way Brian Cox plays this character, and the way that his scenes are shot, the way his cell is so bright white and very clinical, and how with the scene between the two of them is so, there's so much dissonance in that scene. They're talking through bars. Like you said, he tried to kill Will Graham. Graham was trying to catch him. And he was killing and eating his victims. And I mean, this horrific, terrible person. And Will is there to ask him for help. And, you know, he's sending Christmas cards to Will. And he, you know, I mean, there's so much dissonance, and the fact that both of these characters, as they sit in there, you know, because at some point, you know, at this point, Will has gone there to try to kind of pick up the mindset again, to kind of get back into the groove and figure out, you know, how he's going to catch the Tooth Fairy. In this scene where they're sitting there talking, there's just so much tension, and yet it's underplayed. It's like they're being not casual exactly, but they're being cordial to each other. And I have not had many people try to kill me in this world. I don't know that I could be cordial to any of them.
Well, the thing I like that they did in this film is they didn't explicitly show exactly what happened between Will and Lecter, right? It's understated. You have to kind of read in between the lines. Like there's a scene where Will Graham Peterson's character, he's talking to another cop, and he mentions, "Oh, Hector, you know, Lecter, he cut you pretty good." Where, if I'm remembering correctly, in the film Red Dragon, which is, I guess, a remake of this or a redoing of this same story, they show exactly what happened between Graham and Hannibal Lecter, right?
You know, I'll have to be honest with you. I was very much like you. I didn't dig the movie Red Dragon very much, and probably because I was such a fan of Manhunter. So, I mean, it's probably like a season 2 of True Detective situation where if I had only seen that film, I would have probably thought it was a damn good movie. But because of the first version of it, you know, everything was compared to that, and I probably had a chip on my shoulder. So I should probably go back and watch it again, because I don't remember a lot from it. But, you know, and Lecter was the second guy that gets mentioned that, you know, serial killer wise, that Will Graham captured. I mean, he helped capture some guy like Roy Garrett Hobbs or something like that before Lecter. And I think in the book and maybe in the film, he was injured in both of those. So not just psychological injuries, right? But physical injuries are the risk that he's running by doing this. And he knows this when he comes back into the fold. And so does his wife, Molly. That's why she's supportive, but she really doesn't want him to do it.
So I guess that kind of leads to, we can get into the details of Peterson's performance. Like, my personal opinion, like in terms of William Peterson as an actor, I think he's a good actor. I don't think he's a great actor, but for this role, I think he nails it perfectly. But I heard like people, I did a little bit of research and reading, obviously for this film, and I don't know, people had mixed reviews about his performance as Will Graham, which I was kind of shocked by, because I thought he nailed the role perfectly. And what do you think, Frank?
I'm 100% in agreement. Anybody who's panned his performance, I think, missed all the nuance of it. I mean, he, I think, does a fantastic job of showing the angst that Graham has in coming back into this life. I mean, the guy is torn between, I have a happy life. I got out of that situation by the skin of my teeth. I mean, I caught one guy, I caught another guy who cut me up really bad, you know, messed up my mind. I healed my mind. And now I'm living literally on the beach, working on boats, you know, married to someone I'm very happy with. I have a son. I think it's his stepson in the book, but I forget. Yet he still goes back when Crawford shows him the pictures and tells him what's happening, because he has that sense of duty, but he knows what the risk is. I mean, he knows what the risk is. He's been through it. It isn't some sort of academic thing. Well, this might happen to you. It's happened to him. He's been physically assaulted and almost killed, and he's been psychologically damaged. So the stakes are very real to him. He's experienced them before, and yet he still comes back in. So Peterson has to show this sort of angst, for lack of a better word, over being torn by this decision, because he's leaving his wife and his son to do it. And it's one thing to risk yourself, but when you're risking yourself as a member of a family, like your loss is going to affect other people, then it becomes more difficult. And yet at the same time, he was an FBI agent. He was a cop. And what do cops do? I mean, historically, we've always been very stoic. You put up a shell. You don't necessarily show what's going on behind the eyes, and some of that so that the bad guys that you're dealing with can't find a weakness in there and exploit it. And some of it is because some of the stuff that's going on back there is a battle to deal with some of the ugliness that you've encountered. And so Peterson has to show a guy who's learned to be stoic and hide his emotions, who's going through this huge angst over coming back into to this investigation. And so it has to be an understated performance. It can't be this wildly dramatic thing. It has to be subtle. And so I would contend that people who feel like he was robotic or wasn't acting, I think they missed the subtlety of what he was accomplishing.
The thing I particularly liked about his performance was, yes, he does bring kind of a coldness to the role, but that's the whole theme of his character arc, is the fact that he kind of has to become a serial killer to do what he's doing. And he has to get into the mind of a serial killer, and by doing so, understand that he can quite easily become somebody like Hannibal Lecter. He can quite easily become somebody like the Tooth Fairy. And what do all serial killers have in common? Is they have antisocial personality disorders, right? There's just something a little off about them. His coldness that's exactly the reason why he portrayed the character the way he did, was because as the movie progresses, he becomes a serial killer. I thought that, to me, that's a huge theme of the book. Well, not the book, the movie.
Well, he tells his son in the grocery store when his son kind of actually figures out who his dad is, basically, and what's going on. So his son's like 12 or so. He has a conversation with him in the aisle at the grocery store, and he describes it as after he caught the bad guy, after trying to think the way the bad guy thought in order to do so, that he still had the bad guy's thoughts in his head. And then he had to go get help to get him out of his head. And that's it's a good way to describe it to a 12-year-old, but it's a good way to describe it to the rest of the audience too, because you see, as you point out, you see him drifting that direction again. And things occur in the film that cause him to isolate himself. I mean, he sends eventually, because there's some danger to his family, he sends his wife and son to her parents up in Montana for the duration. And he starts talking to the bad guy, to the Tooth Fairy, talking to himself basically, but talking to the Tooth Fairy while he's by himself, and some people have thought that those were cheesy scenes, where he's in the restaurant and looking window at his own reflection. And he says, "It's just you and me now, sport, and I'm going to catch you, damn it." And then he gets interrupted by the waitress and all this. And the music is playing and everything. I mean, I can understand why people think that's a little bit cheesy, but if you look at it, it's actually really good filmmaking, right? I mean, the Tooth Fairy uses mirrors and reflections in his iconography. It's part of his experience. And here is Graham looking at a reflection of himself. He's trying to become like the Tooth Fairy in order to understand the Tooth Fairy, and he's looking at himself in this reflection. I mean, it works on that level. And he's all alone. It's just him and himself to try to finish the job here. And so I mean, again, I think the same people that call that cheesy are probably the same people who said that William L. Peterson wasn't acting very much in this movie. I think he was acting a ton. One of the things that Michael Mann points out that I hadn't really thought about until I read it was that a lot of what's going on with Will Graham is internal, and including like realizations that he's making. And I mean, there's a fantastic scene when he finally realizes how the Tooth Fairy is choosing his victims. And he says some things out loud to help cue in the viewer to what's going on inside his head. But if you watch as he acts that scene, you can see the spark of revelation. You can see him working towards it, and then you can see it happening. And that, I mean, expressing internal thoughts and feelings that, that are rolling around in your head externally as an actor is really hard. I mean, I'm not talking about expressing an emotion here. I'm talking about showing that process on your face. And he really, really nails it. That's so anybody that says he's not a good actor or isn't spectacular in this movie, I think they got blinders on.
Yeah, it's my opinion too. I think they're used to more a different type of acting that's much more expressive or saves. I really enjoyed Nicolas Cage's acting, but if you were to contrast the two of them, like this is like total spectrum, right? Like you have Peterson over here in Manhunter, and then you have Nicolas Cage over here in Con Air or something. I'm just using that as an example where like if you could have one end to the other, that's the best. That's actually quite like that example. And I like both styles of acting. I'm just a big fan of acting in general, right?
But this is the style. This is the style that character required. 100%.
Oh, for sure. Like Nicolas Cage couldn't have done this role.
Oh, maybe he could have, but he would have had to have done it the same way. He would have had to try to show what's going on internally and not just be expressive, because Will Graham is not expressive. He's got a very active amount of expression happening internally as a character, and when you read the book, that's very obvious. But how do you do that on film? I mean, you like movies better than books for your for taking in the stories that you want to enjoy, and there's a lot of advantages to presenting a story on film that you can't really do effectively in a book. But the reverse is also true, and both styles have limitations. And this is the biggest limitation, one of the biggest in film, is showing the internal life of a character. Whereas in a book, it's quite easy in comparison. And I can put you inside the head of the main character. It's, an open door, it's a lock you have to pick on the film. And for Peterson to handle it this way, I think it's stellar. It's just, I think the guy is a really good actor. And after watching the movie he made the previous year, To Live and Die in LA, I watched it recently, and my wife had never seen it. And same with Manhunter. She'd never seen that either. We watched both earlier this year. She was like, what happened to him? He should have been a big star, and so, I mean, obviously, at least to one viewer, there's something there. And I think he made some interesting choices for what projects he was going to be in. And then I think he had a couple of hits, and then he grounded out for a few. And, of course, ultimately and ironically, it was CSI, the very original one that got him back to that pinnacle of, being more famous as an actor. But I think he did a stellar job in To Live and Die in LA, a very different character than Will Graham. And, he did a stellar job as Will Graham too. I mean, I can't imagine maybe I'm like a little turtle, like the turtles in the movie, I imprinted on him as Will Graham, and I can't accept any other actor. But like, I didn't have a problem with Scott Glenn as Jack Crawford in Silence of the Lambs. I didn't have a problem with Anthony Hopkins as Hannibal Lecter. I liked the version better of Brian Cox, but Hopkins is Hannibal. But I can't see anybody else as Will Graham.
Steve here with a quick word from our sponsors.
You mentioned how do they express like eternal thoughts, and on film one device that Michael Mann does that's actually quite smart is Will Graham carries around a recorder.
Mm-hmm.
So he's kind of recording his thoughts into the recorder. So you're hearing it's not in every scene, but in some of the scenes, you're getting his internal thoughts, like when he's investigating the crime scene, as opposed to doing Hollywood's never been able to figure out how to do a voiceover without it sounding corny. So that was a way of Michael Mann, I think, trying to get away from doing the voiceover, which is basically, this is what's going on in this guy's head without him actually expressing it. I thought that was pretty brilliant. It's been copied a lot since. Maybe the people had done it before, but I thought that was a pretty brilliant way of getting his internal thought process out in a non-obtrusive way.
Yeah, and it isn't unrealistic. Sometimes when you're in a situation where you don't want to take the time to write something, you want to keep moving fast, so you just use a recorder, and I think that's totally believable.
I guess we can move on to Tom Noonan, right? And his performance as the Tooth Fairy.
Yeah, chilling.
Tom he has a soft spot for me personally, because I'm a huge fan of the RoboCop movies, the first two. And he stars in the second one, and he plays this like drug addict, cult leader called Kane, and he's just incredible in the movie. So I've always enjoyed Tom's acting, and he fits this role perfectly, because, and this might not be the nicest thing to say about somebody, but you just look at Tom as he looks creepy. Just his look, right? It's like Willem Dafoe, where you look at Willem Dafoe's face and it's like, how did you ever get into movies? You know what I mean? Like, it's just...
Well, that's exactly how, right? Because it's a unique face. But you're right. He is, he's not classically handsome. He's more of a spooky looking guy. He also has I don't know if it's his natural speaking voice. I tend to think so, because it was very similar when he played a small role in Heat, another Michael Mann film. But he's got this voice that also is a little ethereal and a little spooky to go along with the features that he's got. And then, of course, the character of Francis Dollarhide has a cleft palate as well. So he's got this, scar on his lip, and sounds a little. He speaks very carefully because he wants to avoid mouth formations for sounds, so that he can avoid sounding, calling attention to his speech impediment. And that's much more pronounced, that all of that in the book. It's explored a bit more, as is the girl brief girlfriend Reba. And, she calls attention to it a lot more in the book as well. But he's a perfect fit. I can't see, Ray Fiennes is a great actor, I don't think he even comes close to Dollarhide compared to Tom Noonan. But again, it's a Homer thing to say, I know. But
and if you look into his performance, I like the fact that it's not like we're watching like a crazy guy. It's very subtle. There's a fair amount of nuance in it, and you kind of have to read in between the lines what happened to this guy, because the way Michael Mann decided to direct this film was he just didn't get into the Tooth Fairy's background story, like almost at all, really. I mean, it's not almost when does he actually show up on the screen? It's like the 45-minute mark, right?
Yeah. It's well past the halfway mark.
And it's like a big reveal when he actually does show up. And I quite like the fact that we don't get a ton of background information on him. We kind of have to read in between the lines. Like you pointed out, like we see that he had a cleft lip. He's very awkward. He's very antisocial. He's obsessed with this William Blake painting, The Red Dragon. And then in one of the few murders we actually see him do, even though we don't actually see him do it, which is against the tabloid reporter, he kind of describes about, he feels like these people are just not understanding, like that he's becoming something far greater, and they should be happy about the fact that they're involved in this process. And that's pretty much all we get, really. And I prefer not knowing a ton of, I prefer thinking about what the actual motivations of a killer is, or a character in a lot of ways, as opposed to having it spelled out to me in film. It's a little different, and at like novels, I want it kind of a little bit more explicitly told what their motivations are. But on film, I think just the nature of the medium, it lends itself better to ambiguity. I don't know. What's your opinion?
Yeah, when you don't have the time to dive too deep. So you have, every little clue has to do a lot of heavy lifting. And Michael Mann, I think, expects the viewer to fill a lot of that in, like you're talking about. In the book, it's a good little chunk. It's a novella length section, if I remember right. And you get a lot of his backstory, and you also get more of his story when it comes to his whole idea of the metamorphosis that he's undergoing, the change, the becoming, that he wishes to become the Red Dragon. And, that's where the title comes from and so forth. The background from the book, it does have the impact of making you uncomfortably sympathetic towards him, which puts you in a real tough place because he's murdering entire families as an adult. And there's a scene near the end where Crawford and Will Graham get into a bit of an argument there, and then, Crawford's like, hey, it's a foregone conclusion. It's, 11 o'clock, the night of a full moon. Now let's just be ready for the next one. And Graham's, let's pack it in. And he goes, no way, we pack it in when I say we pack it in. You're the one that showed up and showed me these pictures of these two families, knowing good and well I was going to see families, 4, 5, and 6, And he's right. He's like, yeah, I knew, and I'd do it again. And, they had this big blowout, they're arguing. There's just a quiet moment where Graham is talking about Dollarhide, and he says, this all started as an abused child, an abandoned kid, and he starts talking about how this could have formed into the man who's doing these atrocities. And Crawford is kind of sickened by this. And he asks Graham, you're sympathizing with him? And this was in the original cut of the movie. And in the version that I watched with my wife recently, it wasn't there. They cut it out. The director, the recut, cut this part out. And I really missed it because Graham looks over at him and he says, absolutely, I sympathize with him. As a child, my heart bleeds for this person. Someone took a beautiful child and turned them into a monster. Of course I'm sympathetic. At the same time, as an adult, he murders entire families to fuel his sick fantasies. As an adult, somebody ought to blow the sick bastard out of his socks. And then he looks at Crawford and he says, does this way of thinking, does this sort of duality bother you, Jack? And Farina plays it really well. He shifts and is obviously very uncomfortable and then changes the subject. And they just cut that whole minute out of the film. And to me, it's so important. If I ever get to talk to Michael Mann in my life, I'm going to ask him, why would you cut that out? I don't understand. Because it's one of my favorite parts of the movie. It shows what Graham is, trying to do, trying to understand, to show empathy, to be an empath, and understand how this person could have become this horrible person. It's part of his process in figuring out how to catch him too, but it's almost more of a byproduct of it, actually. And it fascinates me. I think it's an incredible view that you don't see in a lot of these kinds of films at all. And it's, like I said, it's probably my favorite scene of the movie.
So I guess we can move on to, which is probably my favorite aspect of the film, is the cinematography. We've talked a lot about the characters and contrasting the novel and the movie and the acting, obviously. But to me, what makes this film so brilliant is Michael Mann's decisions in terms of the cinematography, but also Dante's, who I believe he's worked with his entire career. This film is shot absolutely beautifully. And the contrast with the bright colors that you see in this film, virtually every scene that we see between Will Graham and his wife is shot in this overpowering blue. And it's beautiful. I'm sitting there and I'm watching this film. And I'm I almost kind of want to see an entire romantic movie just shot in this blue, because it's stunning. It's works of art. Manhunter is one of those few, well, I wouldn't say few, but it's one of those films where you go, yes, this is the art of filmmaking.
Yeah.
like perfectly boiled down, right? In terms of also the use of the synth, I wouldn't say like heavy synth music, but the synthetic background music that is going through a lot of these scenes. There's the final shot at the end where Will Graham, he's at the lake and
ocean, the ocean.
Oh yeah, the ocean, and there's a pinkish hue on the lake, and it's filmed kind of like at dusk type. And the still of that shot, I showed to a couple of people at work and a couple of people in my personal life, and I'm like, this is art.
Yeah.
Right. If you were to just screen cap this or screen cap it, I'm using a phone, but if you were to just make a piece of art and throw this up in a gallery, it should be appreciated with the, well, I mean, I'm not a huge fan of modern art. I mean, this actually should be appreciated as opposed to what passes as a lot of modern art now.
And you're talking about the shot that the credits roll over, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then there's the shot where they're quickly trying to get fingerprints or some information off some toilet paper, and the contrast between, like, we go from like a bright, almost kind of like a green to a red to a blue, and almost all those stills, they're just works of art. They really are, and
very, very, it really adds a frenetic feel to those scenes, which are already shot to be chaotic and fast paced.
And it's hyper stylish, right? And I've made this argument before. Like, I could probably watch an entire film if it was shot in this style with no dialogue. I can just sit there and watch it with the background of the music going on, because to me, this is what I really appreciate about films, where, yeah, the storytelling is important. Obviously, you have to tell a story, but you should be able to convey almost moving art with music and convey emotions without anything really being said. Sorry, the thing that perfectly, the scene in particular that I really enjoy, that I think perfectly conveys this, Will Graham and his wife, they've already been moved up to Montana, and Will Graham is telling his wife, I'm going full in again. And she's like, well, you're going to get hurt. And he's like, well, I have to do this. I have to stop these killings. So he tells her, I'm going back, and I'm going into full Hannibal Lecter mode again. And with the synthetic music playing, and it slowly cuts to him in the restaurant, and he's looking in the mirror, and there's the rain coming down. They almost didn't need to say the line where he says, like, well, it's just me and you now, because I already got it. I already know exactly where he's going to go without even saying it. He's going right back to, I'm going to inhabit the mind of a serial killer, where I've been putting one foot in and trying to keep one foot out. Now I'm going to put both my feet in, and it's conveyed without him even saying anything. To me, that's film. That is what makes film unique as an art.
Well, and that is the whole, I mean, it all has to work together in filmmaking. And, you talk about the blue that they shoot him and Molly in almost every scene. And I mean, the opening scene is the light blue of the ocean, and him and Crawford sitting on the beach as Crawford's trying to recruit him, and Molly and Kevin walk by. And so blue continually shows up whenever it has to do with his family. And so blue is almost like his safe place, and then, and you don't see those strong hues and colors as often elsewhere. And even if you do, they're harsher. And they're, they contrast with the softer blues that you're talking about. And so I agree. I think but it can't just be awesome cinematography for the sake of looking good, even though it does. It always has to be forwarding the story and the character and the mood in a very precise and purposeful way. And he does that. He does that. And he does that so well, as you point out, that in some cases dialogue isn't even necessary. And in some cases, there's a couple of scenes that I think the dialogue maybe even takes away from it. But those are nitpicks. So I agree with you. The cinematography, the shots. I mean, there's a shot when Graham goes to the first crime scene, when he first agrees to go look at, I think it's the Jacoby crime scene, but I don't remember which. But it's the first one you see, and it's it's shot in such an incredible way. I mean, from the darkness of the house to then bright lights to Suddenly you see the bloodstains and matted carpet from drag marks from blood and, outlines, chalk outlines and so forth. But when he first walks in to the bedroom, they actually do like a top-down shot from above the door. So you see the bedroom door open up from above, and it's dark, and it's evocative of what Dollarhide probably did, opening the door when it's dark. And I mean, he just does a ton of these shots, and the way that they're lit absolutely captures the mood. And then the music, both the soundtrack and the score are perfectly matched to the scene that they're in. This is one of my favorite soundtracks too, which so is The Last of the Mohicans, which is another Michael Mann film. So he really knows his music.
Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors.
Yeah, well, and it's also this style of Manhunter really kind of created a style of cinematography that has been copied endlessly ever since. Like if you look at like CSI, it's almost like they looked at Manhunter and said, yeah, let's do something like that, which is, and in the previous one that we talked about too, 7 was the same case where 7 came up with this very unique visual style, and it has been copied endlessly ever since, where it like the terms of like using like the extreme colors, and I think it's slowly starting to come back now where people are appreciating it. I don't know if you've seen the film Mandy recently. It came out, I believe it was like 2 years ago, and it's a Canadian director did it. Maybe we can talk about it. It stars Nicolas Cage. It's kind of a bizarre sci-fi movie, and he explicitly says that a lot of the visuals in the film I based off Manhunter, because Manhunter was such an important part of my growth as a filmmaker, and that visual style that is apparent in it. Now, I find it, Michael Mann's films always look really good, but in terms of hyper stylized, like the way Manhunter is, this is kind of unique in the sense, like, I don't recall him ever using these very striking color palettes in his films. His films have always looked really good, but in terms of like the extreme use of blues and greens and reds and pinks, I don't recall him ever really using it again. But if you listen to interviews with a lot of filmmakers, they explicitly say that this film really inspired their style of filmmaking.
Well, this was like the culmination of what he learned by making Miami Vice, the TV show. Because he did use a lot of the brighter colors and then certain angles and transitions and cuts, a lot of which I think, made their way into Manhunter and were probably more superior in the way that they were used in Manhunter. But he cut his teeth on those doing it in Miami Vice. And I'm trying to remember, I haven't seen Thief in so long. I know that musically Thief had a lot of the same components. I mean, they had, I think Tangerine Dream did the score, and he used the music in much the same way as he did on the TV show and in this movie Manhunter. But I can't remember if the palette was similar or not. I remember it being more of a darker film as far as how it was shot.
Yeah, I'm also just a big fan of the 80s in general, where like that's the very first thing when you watch this film, it's very 80s. It's very 80s, right? Like just even the suits and everything like that. That's what my wife was watching, and she was like laughing. She's like, "Oh my God, it's so 80s." And I'm like, you know what? Some of the stuff didn't work. Some of the stuff did work though. Will
Graham is a natty dresser, man. I'd dress like him today and feel good about it.
Some of the stuff works, in my opinion. Like I've always been a big fan of the 80s kind of look. Unironically, I mean, now I guess it's starting to come back. Like I'm seeing people with mustaches and people wearing Hawaiian shirts. But I've always worn Hawaiian shirts. Like I've always worn like bright color shirts, and maybe it doesn't come like across if you guys listen to the podcast and type of the stuff I talk about. But like I've always been a big fan of the style of the 80s, and yeah, this film is very 80s. Not just like just everything about it is very 80s. And
yeah, the music is very 80s. And well, I know we're coming up on our time here pretty quick, and I can't in good conscience leave without touching on that there are different versions of this movie. Not as much as like Ridley Scott's Blade Runner, has so many different versions, but there are some different cuts, and there are a couple of additional scenes that I saw in the cut of the film that I picked up on Amazon Prime. There's 2 extra scenes with Molly, his wife. Both of, she like comes and meets him at a hotel while he's traveling, and they have a nice scene. And then there's another one with her too. They're both really nice scenes, but I didn't think they were necessary. And I can see why. I have to agree with him cutting those out of the original cut. Much to my consternation, he cut out that empathic piece that I described earlier, where Will Graham sympathizes with him, too much to the discomfort of Jack Crawford. But the one scene that I watched recently, and you can find it on YouTube, that they shot, but it was never in the film, and I didn't make it into the various cut versions either, was a scene right before the very final scene of the movie. Now, the final scene of the movie, spoiler alert, is Will Graham on the beach, as you mentioned, at their beach house, I think in Florida, and the turtles that they created the hatchery for have hatched, and they're making their way into the sea, and most of them are going to make it. I mean, it's very symbolic, very, very much a metaphor. And him and his wife and his son are there. It's very idyllic. And you get the idea that Will Graham is going to survive and come back from this. And right before that, the scene before that is in the regular film is him at this crime scene after having killed the Tooth Fairy and rescued Reba, the blind woman who was in a relationship with Francis Dollarhide. And he's hugging her, and she asks who he is, and he just says who he is. And then it cuts to him on the beach and Molly and Kevin coming back. Well, there was supposed to be a scene in between the two, and it was a scene where Will Graham goes to the home of the family that was next on Dollarhide's list. And he shows up on their doorstep, and they figure out who he is. They know who he is. And the husband, the husband has a gun in his, small of his back. He's like feeling like he has to protect his family, even though the Tooth Fairy's gone. And the wife keeps inviting, Will Graham in for coffee. And it's raining out, much like it was in that airport scene at the restaurant that you referenced earlier. And every time she invites Will Graham in, he says no. And it's an awkward scene that's very well acted by Will Peterson. And he eventually says that he just wanted to see them. And it makes so much thematic sense to me, because here's the guy who, this was what he was doing it for. Right. And now he's seeing, to break away from having been Francis Dollarhide, he's seeing the people whose lives he saved by preventing him from moving forward. And far be it for me to be critical of a filmmaker like Michael Mann. The guy's a genius, in filmmaking, but I didn't like the 2 extra scenes with Molly. I thought they were redundant, and I really missed this scene. This unused scene where he visited the next family. I think that would have been very touching, because his face is all messed up, and he's, and the acting by William L. Peterson in that scene is incredible. It's as good as when he's having the revelation of how, Dollarhide is picking his victims. So those are not all, but those are some of the changes between the various cuts of this movie. And so depending on which one you see, if you have an old DVD, you might see a different version than if you pick it up streaming.
Yeah, I found my DVD, so I watched my DVD a couple of times. So I'm not even quite sure which version of that one it is. It's just,
probably the original version would be my guess.
The one thing I would have liked to have seen them somewhat do, I don't know, it would have been a different film, but I think it would have been interesting, is there's the scene where they're trying to get the Tooth Fairy all riled up, right? So they're like writing an article with the tabloid character that Will Graham hates, saying that he's like having sexual relations with his mother and like a bunch of other stuff, and that he's a homosexual, and try to get him to make a mistake. And there's a picture that they take together. Well, initially it's just supposed to be Graham. And the tabloid writer says, no, I want to be in it. And you can tell Graham's like, oh, I don't think this is a good idea. I would have liked to have seen a film where he's like, oh, no, yeah, you know, you can get into the picture. And he gets into the picture, and we know what happens to the tabloid writer. He gets killed by the Tooth Fairy, where it's just like, did Will Graham know that the Tooth Fairy was going to get him type thing? Because he's slowly inhabiting the mind of a serial killer, right? Like, that's the theme. And is that something that he's going to have to live with his entire life? You know, in that moment, he was acting like a serial killer, quite literally. But that would have made it would have been a different film, right? Because Peterson's supposed to be the hero, right? At the end of the film, he's got the bad guy. He's been through hell, and he got out of it, and everything's going to be okay. But
which is how the book ends too. I mean, there's a different twist in the book. In the book, the Dollarhide character doesn't die during that climactic scene at the house. He actually escapes, and another body is suspected to be his. And then he goes to Florida and attacks Will Graham's family. And he ends up, I think, getting shot on the beach, and that's where it ends. I actually like Michael Mann's ending better. Either one works. The other thing that gets brought up in this film is this idea of there being a quote bloom on the woman, and it's something that Graham says.
Yeah, can you explain this to me a little bit better? Because it's one of the parts of the film that I found a little confused.
I mean, some of it is about budding sexuality, I think, is the way some people take it. But essentially, I mean, he's just the woman is the focus for Dollarhide. The family are just incidental. They are tasks to be handled so that he can spend time with the woman. They are at best witnesses to what he is becoming. And that's all that he really thinks about them as. But the woman is who he's interested in, and he sees something special in her. And so he picks, as Graham points out, he picks these women very carefully. He doesn't they're not choices of convenience. He's looking for women who have, I would say, maybe some kind of an inner light that comes out, that shows up. It's not, I don't not just mean physical beauty, but more almost spiritual beauty. And so he focuses on that. And this film is so much about the duality of Graham and Dollarhide. And Graham's family is like all the families. It's smaller, but it otherwise is like all the families that Dollarhide targets. And Molly very much has that bloom, and you see her being shot that way. And whether that's objective or that's in the eyes of Graham, because he's our protagonist, you could argue one or the other. But certainly, like when he's dreaming on the plane about her, it's a very idealized version. It's very clear that he loves her. And when you love someone, you see them with different eyes, and maybe you could argue you see their truer self, but you also, don't see them in the same way that much of the world sees them. So maybe that's what's going on there. But I think what Mann is trying to show is Molly has that bloom, that same bloom that would attract Dollarhide if he saw it. And so in a way, Graham trying to save this next family is, he's trying to save someone very much like Molly. And so it's an interesting kind of duality there, that's going on. And you talk about the cinematography, the way they shoot Molly just reinforces that.
Oh yeah, for sure. There's actually an interesting fact about that scene on the plane, where apparently the studio just didn't have money to build a stage for that scene. So they just got tickets for a plane, and they brought cameras on there, and then they bribed the passengers and the people operating the plane with merchandise from the movie. And they're like, just let us film this.
Well, they weren't supposed to, and some people got mad. But they booked a flight with 40 or so people on it from the movie. Yeah. So a lot of the people on the flight were part of it. But then they just pulled out the cameras and started shooting, and it ticked a few people out, which is kind of funny. We talked about William Friedkin and his guerrilla tactics in some of his movies. And this was definitely guerrilla filmmaking here on Michael Mann's part, for sure.
No, it's interesting you bring up William Friedkin there just for a second, because we've been talking about Michael Mann and his hyper stylized way of filmmaking. In a lot of ways, they're very similar directors in terms of the themes that they tackle. Very kind of male dominated type themes, in my opinion. I can't really think of a Michael Mann movie that has like a very strong female lead off the top of my head, or William Peterson.
I think you could argue that maybe Last of the Mohicans, Madeline Stowe character is pretty strong. And then in Miami Vice, the Asian, South American Asian woman, I can't remember her name, the one that has a relationship with Sonny Crockett. Actually, I guess she's Cuban and Asian. She's a very strong character. So, yeah. But your point is well taken. I mean, even if you look at like Heat, will probably arguably maybe his best known Ashley Judd, and is maybe the biggest character female wise in there, and her role is definitely support. So I think you're onto something.
And then you contrast the styles, right? They're almost polar opposite in a lot of ways, where you watch a William Friedkin film and you could tell it's very done with a punk rock aesthetic to it all, where it's very guerrilla and they're filming right on the streets, where Michael Mann, you could tell it's very precise. He's thought about this for these particular shots for probably months and months and months, if not years. I just thought that was interesting. They just came to my head right now in terms of contrasting, where they're very similar, but they're almost the polar opposites in a lot of ways. But you're going to wrap up like your final thoughts on the film, Frank. So I guess go ahead.
I would say that, this is one of my top 10 movies. It is a product of its time, I will admit, but, so is Casablanca, so are a lot of movies. Chinatown is a product of its time, and they're outstanding movies. I think that Michael Mann wrote a wonderful adaptation, shot it beautifully. It's acted extraordinarily well in a very understated way. It's gripping. It is a procedural, which you don't see a lot of movies that are true procedurals, but this is very much about how will they catch him. I mean, you find out who the bad guy is halfway through. It's not a whodunit. It's a how or will they catch him. And so I like that. I mean, I write procedurals. A lot of my books are procedurals, so I guess I'm biased in that way. But stellar acting, and I hadn't watched it in a number of years when I watched it again for this discussion, and like To Live and Die in LA, because I watched them almost as a pairing. I thought it held up wonderfully.
Yeah, I'd have to say this is probably one of my favorite movies from that 80s time period. Like I pointed out earlier, I could probably just watch this film without any dialogue. I just find it visually stunning. The use of music, William Peterson's understated acting in the role. I love it. It's, in particular, the visual style that's been copied a lot, but it's not very well done. Some of the guys that copy it do a very good job of copying it, but it is such a unique. It's so unique in its visual style. It's really what makes it stand out to me. Yeah, I really enjoyed it. And like I said, I contrasted. On our previous episode we did together, we talked about Seven, which had a very unique visual style. Manhunter, the same thing. If you guys are interested, maybe we can kind of continue with this cop serial killer type thing, or maybe do you guys want us to explore some more of Michael Mann's movies? Or
meanwhile, find a copy of Manhunter and do yourself a favor and spend an hour and 45 minutes of artistic joy.